The courthouse was buzzing that morning, alive with a tension that seemed to ripple through the marble floors and settle over every bench in the room. It wasn't an ordinary trial. Reporters had already crowded the hallway outside, long before the doors opened, their cameras ready, their pens poised, eager to capture even the smallest detail that might stir tomorrow's headlines. Families of both the accused and the victims sat in hushed clusters, their eyes darting nervously toward the heavy oak doors that led to the courtroom. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with expectation. The defendant, a man in his late 30s, sat with unsettling confidence at the defense table. His suit was neatly pressed, his hair combed back, and he wore an expression that hinted at smugness rather than fear. He leaned back casually in his chair, occasionally whispering to his attorney, as if the whole proceeding was little more than an inconvenience. He believed the case against him was weak, riddled with holes the defense would easily exploit. But the prosecution had one card left to play, an unexpected witness. When the bailiff announced her name, the room fell into a startled silence. A child, no older than 10, slowly walked toward the witness stand. Her small shoes clicked softly against the polished floor, each step echoing louder than the last. Heads turned, eyebrows raised. Some of the jurors exchanged glances, clearly wondering what role such a young girl could possibly play in a case of this magnitude. Her name was Emily. She was slender, with chestnut brown hair pulled into a neat braid that hung down her back. A white ribbon tied at the end swayed with each movement, a stark contrast to the somber suits and grim faces that surrounded her. She wore a simple pale blue dress, one that looked chosen carefully by someone who wanted her to appear innocent, yet dignified. Emily's face revealed neither fear nor excitement. Her wide hazel eyes scanned the room as though she was memorizing it, capturing the image of a place she had never been before, but somehow understood the seriousness of. She wasn't there to play pretend. She was there because she carried a memory that could tilt the balance of justice. When she finally climbed into the witness chair, it seemed almost too large for her. The wooden arms stretched wide, and the seat swallowed her small frame. But Emily sat upright, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She did not fidget, did not look away. The judge, an older man with thinning gray hair and sharp glasses perched on his nose, cleared his throat. His voice was deep and steady as he reminded the courtroom of the rules. No outbursts, no interruptions, absolute silence. He knew how fragile this moment was. A child on the stand could break easily under pressure, and if that happened, the defense would seize it instantly, unraveling her credibility before she even began. "Do you understand why you're here today, Emily?" the judge asked gently. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice soft but clear enough to carry across the hushed room. The prosecutor, a woman named Miss Carter, stepped forward. She was known for her calm demeanor, her ability to make even the most nervous witness feel at ease. She smiled reassuringly at Emily, as though to remind her she wasn't alone. "Emily," Miss Carter began, "I'm going to ask you a few questions. If you don't understand something, you can tell me. And if you need a break, you can let me know. All right?" Emily nodded. From the defense table, the attorney leaned back with a smirk. He had seen this tactic before, using a child to sway emotions, to draw pity from the jury. But he was confident it wouldn't work. Children, he believed, were unreliable. They mixed imagination with reality. They told half-truths without meaning to, and they could be manipulated easily under cross-examination. He was already planning how to dismantle her testimony when his turn came. Ms. Carter continued softly, "Emily, do you remember the night of April 12th? The courtroom leaned in. That was the night in question, the night the crime had been committed. Emily's hazel eyes flickered slightly, but she nodded again. "Yes, I remember," she said. Her words were steady, not rehearsed. It was the kind of answer that immediately caught the jury's attention. "Can you tell us what you were doing that evening?" Ms. Carter asked. Emily spoke slowly, carefully. "I was walking home with my mom. We passed by the park, and then we saw the police lights. There were officers everywhere, and the dog." At the mention of the dog, the room shifted. Reporters' pens scratched furiously across notepads. The jury sat up straighter. Even the defendant's smirk faltered ever so slightly. Miss Carter nodded, gently guiding her forward. "The dog. Do you remember his name?" Emily's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Rex, the German Shepherd." That was when the whispers began. A child remembering the name of a police canine was one thing, but the way she said it, with absolute certainty, made everyone pause. She wasn't guessing. She knew. The judge's gavel tapped lightly, restoring silence. At the defense table, the attorney scribbled notes furiously. This wasn't the direction he expected the testimony to go. Meanwhile, Emily continued, her voice unwavering. Rex was barking, loud. He was standing in front of a man. The man wanted to leave, but Rex wouldn't let him. Every word seemed to echo in the courtroom. The defendant shifted in his seat, crossing his arms tightly. For the first time that day, he no longer looked comfortable. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. A dog's instincts were one thing, but paired with the eyewitness memory of a child innocent, untainted by bias, that was something entirely different. Emily lowered her voice slightly, as if reliving the moment. "I'll never forget how he growled. He wasn't scared. He knew something was wrong." The defense attorney immediately objected, his voice rising in protest. "Your Honor, the witness is a child. She's interpreting an animal's behavior. That is speculation, not evidence." The judge raised a hand. "Sustained in part. The jury will disregard the witness's interpretation, but she may continue to describe what she saw." Miss Carter nodded and turned back to Emily. "You're doing great. Just tell us exactly what you remember. No more, no less." Emily sat a little taller. She didn't look at the prosecutor, or the defense, or even the judge. She looked directly at the jury. Her small voice carried a weight that silenced every murmur in the room. "That's the dog," she said firmly. "I remember him. I remember that night. He was barking at that man. He wouldn't let him go." And with those words, the room erupted not with noise, but with a heavy, undeniable realization. The young girl hadn't just identified the police dog. She had drawn a direct line between the animal, the crime, and the man sitting at the defense table. The moment was electrifying, and it was only the beginning. The silence that followed Emily's first words was unlike anything the courtroom had experienced before. It wasn't the polite hush that accompanied legal proceedings. It was a stunned, heavy quiet that pressed against every person present. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, as though they needed to be closer to the truth unfolding before them. Reporters, usually quick to whisper or scribble, sat frozen for a beat, their pens hovering just above paper, reluctant to break the spell. On the defense side, the attorney's smirk had hardened into a tight line. His hand twitched as he adjusted his tie, though he tried to mask it as a casual gesture. He had expected a child's testimony to be shaky, unreliable, something he could dismantle in minutes. But Emily's clarity was unsettling. There was no hesitation, no fumbling for words. She spoke with the kind of certainty adults often lacked. The defendant himself shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He had entered the courtroom with a kind of arrogance, confident that the state had nothing substantial. But as he watched the small girl on the stand, her steady eyes fixed on the jury, unease began to stir in his chest. He tapped his foot against the floor, a subtle rhythm betraying the nerves he tried to suppress. Judge Harmon cleared his throat. His voice, deep and deliberate, rolled across the chamber. "Order in the court. Let us proceed." Ms. Carter, the prosecutor, gave Emily a reassuring nod. She had handled dozens of witnesses in her career, but this was different. Children were unpredictable, sometimes fragile, sometimes startlingly strong. And this child seemed more prepared than anyone had expected. "Emily," Miss Carter said softly, "you mentioned Rex, the police dog. Do you remember what happened when you first saw him that night?" Emily nodded, her braid swaying slightly. "Yes, my mom and I were standing near the street. Rex was barking really loud. I remember covering my ears because it was so strong. He was pulling at his leash, trying to get closer to the man." Her words painted an image so vivid that the jurors seemed to picture it themselves. Some of them scribbled notes, while others simply stared, entranced. The defense attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. We're relying on the interpretation of a child who claims to understand an animal's behavior. This is irrelevant speculation." Judge Harmon raised a hand, his brow furrowed. "Sustained in part. The jury will disregard any interpretation of the dog's intent. However, the witness may continue describing what she directly observed." The defense attorney sat down with a huff, but his eyes never left Emily. He was studying her now, searching for cracks in her composure. Unbothered, Miss Carter leaned closer. "Emily, you don't have to tell us what Rex was thinking. Just tell us what you saw and heard." Emily nodded again. "I saw the man. He was standing near the park entrance. Rex wouldn't stop barking at him. The officers were shouting, but the man looked nervous. He tried to step away, but Rex blocked him." The words landed heavily. Several members of the jury turned their gaze toward the defendant, who now sat rigid, his jaw clenched. Emily's eyes flickered briefly toward him too. For the first time, her voice wavered slightly, but not in fear, more in disgust. "That's the man Rex barked at," she said, pointing directly at the defendant. Gasps rippled through the room. The bailiff barked for order, but the shock had already settled into the air. Even Judge Harmon shifted slightly in his seat, his stern expression giving way to quiet contemplation. The defense attorney immediately shot up. "Objection. Your Honor, this is an outright identification from a minor years after the event. Highly unreliable." The judge held up his hand again. "The objection is noted. The jury will consider the witness's age and perspective in weighing the testimony." The defense attorney sat, but his face flushed red. His confidence was slipping, thread by thread. Miss Carter adjusted her papers and spoke again, her tone calm and steady. "Emily, when Rex barked at the man, did you notice anything else?" Emily's hazel eyes narrowed as she concentrated. She didn't rush. She thought carefully, as though she were flipping through the pages of her memory. Finally, she said, "Yes, the man. He looked scared. He tried to talk to the officers, but his voice was shaking. And then Rex growled. He didn't stop until 2 officers came and held the man back." The jurors scribbled furiously. One older woman on the panel leaned her chin against her hand, eyes fixed on Emily with an intensity that betrayed her growing belief. The defense attorney leaned toward his client, whispering harshly, but the defendant kept his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. His earlier bravado was gone. His hands clenched and unclenched, betraying the tension in his chest. Ms. Carter continued carefully. "Emily, were you afraid that night?" Emily hesitated for the first time. Her small fingers twisted together, but she didn't look away. "Yes," she admitted softly. "I was scared. But not of Rex. He looked brave, like he knew what to do. I was scared of the man. He kept looking around, like he wanted to run. I'll never forget his face." The defendant flinched visibly. The jury noticed. Judge Harmon's gavel struck once more, silencing the murmurs that threatened to break out again. His expression was unreadable, but he, too, leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on the girl who now commanded the room. Emily sat straighter in her chair. Despite her age, despite the weight of the room pressing down on her, she didn't falter. Her eyes swept the jury, her voice steadier than many adult witnesses who had taken that stand before her. "That night," she said firmly, "Rex barked at that man, and he didn't stop. I know what I saw." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time since the trial began, the defendant looked cornered. His composure cracked, and sweat gathered at his temples. The smirk he had worn so confidently in the morning was gone, replaced by the tight-lipped fear of a man who realized a child's words might undo everything. The defense attorney shifted in his chair, already strategizing, already planning to hammer the child during cross-examination. But deep down, even he sensed the danger. Emily was not the timid, confused witness he had expected. She was sharp. She was steady. And worse, she had nothing to gain by lying. The jurors knew it too. They had seen witnesses fumble, twist words, hedge their truths. But this child, with her clear memory and calm delivery, spoke like someone who simply wanted to be heard. And in that truth lay a power no lawyer could easily erase. By the time Emily finished her answer, the air in the courtroom was charged, heavy with anticipation. Everyone knew something had shifted. The girl on the stand had not only identified a police dog, she had planted a seed of doubt that threatened to grow into undeniable proof. And as the session adjourned for a brief recess, one fact became painfully clear to the defense. The trial was no longer in their control. The air in the courtroom had grown heavy, almost suffocating, after Emily's firm words. The recess had given the jurors time to whisper among themselves. But when the bailiff announced that the proceedings would resume, everyone filed back in with the kind of focus reserved for moments when history might be made. The defendant sat rigid at the defense table. His attorney leaned close, whispering instructions into his ear, but his eyes were elsewhere, darting nervously toward the doors at the back of the chamber. It was as if he sensed something was coming, something beyond his control. Judge Harmon returned to his seat, his black robe rustling as he adjusted himself behind the bench. His voice carried authority as he announced, "We will now continue with the testimony of the witness. Ms. Carter, you may proceed." The prosecutor stood, her file tucked neatly under her arm. She glanced at Emily, who remained in the witness stand, calm and composed despite the weight of dozens of eyes fixed upon her. The girl's hands were folded neatly in her lap, her braid lying over one shoulder like a line of quiet strength. "Emily," Miss Carter began gently, "you mentioned a police dog earlier. Do you remember what he looked like?" "Yes," Emily said softly, her hazel eyes brightening. "He was big, brown and black. His ears stood up, and his eyes were very sharp. He looked strong. Do you think you would recognize him if you saw him again?" Miss Carter asked. Emily nodded without hesitation. "Yes." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens scratching, cameras shifting for a better angle. The jurors' attention sharpened, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Miss Carter glanced toward the bailiff. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce Rex, the K-9 officer present on the night in question." The judge gave a solemn nod. "Proceed." The heavy wooden doors opened, and in walked Officer Daniels, a tall, broad-shouldered man in uniform. Beside him trotted Rex, the German shepherd. His coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, tan and black, with a sheen that spoke of meticulous care. His movements were fluid, powerful, yet disciplined, every step aligned with his handlers. The effect on the room was immediate. The jurors straightened, the audience gasped softly, and even Judge Harmon's stern expression softened for a moment. Rex was no ordinary dog. He radiated presence and authority that filled the space without a sound. Emily's face lit up the moment she saw him. Her eyes widened, and the corners of her lips turned upward in recognition. She didn't wait for Miss Carter's prompt. She leaned forward slightly, her small hand rising as she pointed. "That's him," she said firmly, her voice ringing clear in the hushed room. "That's Rex." The courtroom seemed to freeze. The defendant's face paled. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. He tried to mask it with a scoff, but the unease in his eyes betrayed him. His attorney placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him, but the damage was done. The jurors had noticed. Miss Carter smiled gently at Emily. "You're certain?" "Yes," Emily replied. "I could never forget him." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is theatrics. The state parades a dog into this courtroom, and now we're to believe a child's memory from years ago is flawless." Judge Harmon regarded him sternly. "The objection is noted. The jury will determine the weight of the witness's identification. Proceed." Ms. Carter paced slowly before the jury box, her tone measured. "Emily, can you tell us what you remember about Rex that night?" Emily's gaze shifted from the jury to the dog, her expression serious. Rex wasn't just barking. He barked at him. She raised her hand again, pointing directly at the defendant. A collective gasp swept through the gallery. The reporters' pens flew across their pads, the scratching sound loud in the otherwise silent room. Emily continued, her voice steady despite the gravity of her words. "I remember it so clearly. Rex wouldn't let the man move. Every time he tried to step, Rex barked louder. His body blocked the way, and his teeth showed. He knew something was wrong. I know he did." The defense attorney slammed his hand against the table. "Objection. The witness is ascribing intention to an animal again. This is absurd." But this time, Judge Harmon did not immediately respond. He studied Emily carefully, then turned his gaze to the jurors. Some were leaning forward so far they nearly touched the railing. Others whispered briefly to one another before catching themselves. The testimony had landed. "Objection is sustained in part," the judge finally said. "The jury will disregard interpretation of the animal's thoughts. However, the witness's description of what she observed will stand." The defense attorney sat back down, fuming. But Emily wasn't finished. Her eyes returned to the jury, and her voice dropped to a near whisper, forcing everyone to listen closely. "Rex wasn't wrong. He barked at that man, and I've never forgotten his face. It's the same face sitting there today." The defendant shifted violently, his chair scraping against the floor as he half turned away from her. The sudden movement only heightened the tension. The juror's eyes snapped to him, registering his discomfort, his barely concealed panic. For a long moment, the room was still. Then Rex, who had sat calmly by Officer Daniels's side the whole time, let out a low, rumbling growl. It was quiet, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound rippled through the courtroom like a shockwave. Gasps erupted again. Some in the gallery leaned back instinctively, startled. Officer Daniels placed a steadying hand on Rex's collar, but the dog's eyes never left the defendant. The timing was uncanny, too perfect to ignore. The jury exchanged looks, their expressions a mix of surprise and conviction. The growl had not been prompted, not staged. It had been instinctive, natural, a reaction as real as Emily's testimony. The defense attorney leapt to his feet again, shouting, "Your Honor, this is outrageous. We cannot allow an animal's growl to influence the jury." Judge Harmon's gavel slammed down sharply. "Order! Order in the court!" The booming echo restored silence, but the impression had already sunk deep into the hearts of everyone present. Emily, meanwhile, sat taller in her chair. She didn't flinch at the growl. She didn't look scared. Instead, she looked vindicated, as though the dog had spoken for her, confirming what she already knew. Rex's growl had said what words could not. And for the first time, even those who had doubted her began to wonder if perhaps this little girl and the police dog shared a truth that could not be ignored. The defense attorney sank into his chair, muttering furiously under his breath. The defendant himself sat stiff, his hands trembling slightly. His earlier arrogance had crumbled. The moment had shifted the trial entirely. The dog had appeared, the girl had identified him, and together, in a way no one had anticipated, they had turned the courtroom upside down. And Emily had only just begun to reveal what she remembered. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, pressing on the ears and hearts of everyone present. Emily's eyes were steady, her small hand pointed directly at the defendant, her words sharp and clear. He barked at that man. He wouldn't let him go. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. No hesitation, no faltering. Her voice, though high and youthful, rang with conviction. Gasps escaped from several members of the audience, and even a few jurors shifted forward, eyes wide, as though to ensure they'd heard her correctly. The defendant's face, previously smug and unconcerned, tightened instantly. He straightened in his seat, his jaw clenching, eyes darting toward his lawyer, as though silently demanding an immediate rescue. But the damage was already done. Emily's finger, that small but powerful gesture, seemed to pierce straight through the walls of his carefully constructed defense. The shockwave, the defense attorney sprang to his feet, his voice booming with objection. "Objection, Your Honor. The child is making speculative claims. She cannot possibly know the meaning of a dog's behavior." The judge raised an eyebrow, his expression calm but thoughtful. "Overruled for now," he said evenly. "The witness may continue. The jury will decide how much weight to give her testimony." It was a calculated decision, but one that electrified the room. The defense attorney sat back down, clearly displeased, but there was little he could do. The jury's attention had already shifted, their eyes glued to the small girl who had just delivered a line that might tip the scales of justice. Emily's lips trembled for just a moment, but not with fear, with determination. She folded her hands together and spoke again, painting the scene in vivid strokes. "I remember that night. I was standing near the corner when the police cars came. I saw the lights, red and blue, flashing everywhere. And then I saw the man," she nodded at the defendant, "running. He was trying to get away. But Rex was there. Rex growled and barked, blocking his way. The man tried to push past him, but Rex wouldn't move." Every word sank deeper into the room. The jurors leaned forward unconsciously, as though drawn into her story. Even the judge, usually composed and detached, seemed to pay closer attention, his pen pausing mid-note. Emily's small hands clenched together as she continued. He looked scared. The man. He wasn't scared of the officers. He was scared of Rex. The description hit hard. The image of the defendant panicking, confronted not by human officers, but by an unshakable police dog, planted itself firmly in the minds of those listening. The defendant's unease. The defendant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His jaw twitched, and he tugged at his collar as if the courtroom air had suddenly grown stifling. He whispered something harshly to his attorney, but the microphone didn't catch it. The body language, however, was clear. He was rattled. The prosecutor seized the moment, stepping closer to Emily with gentle encouragement. "Emily," he said softly, "you mentioned Rex barked at this man. Can you describe exactly what happened when Rex did that?" Emily nodded quickly. "Rex barked loud. Not like a regular bark. It was deep, like he was warning everyone. He stood in front of the man and growled. The man stopped for a second, like he didn't know what to do. Then he tried to run around, but Rex moved faster. He wouldn't let him go. She turned to face the jury, her eyes shining with honesty. That's when the officers came and caught him. The defense's counterattack, the defense attorney rose again, his irritation barely hidden beneath a thin veil of professionalism. He approached the witness stand slowly, his voice dripping with condescension. "Emily," he began, "you're a very brave little girl, but you're also very young, aren't you?" She nodded. "And sometimes, young people don't always remember things exactly as they happened, do they? Maybe you saw the dog barking, but perhaps it wasn't at my client. Maybe it was just barking at the noise, the lights, the commotion. Dogs bark all the time, don't they?" The courtroom held its breath. Everyone waited to see if Emily would falter under the pressure. But the girl surprised them all. She shook her head firmly. No, he was barking at him. At that man. She pointed again at the defendant, without a shred of hesitation. "I saw it. I know what I saw." The defense attorney's smirk faltered. The jury's reaction across the jury box, subtle but telling expressions appeared. One juror leaned back with arms crossed, but his eyebrows rose, intrigued by Emily's certainty. Another, a middle-aged woman in glasses, gave the child a sympathetic nod, as though silently affirming her courage. A third juror scribbled furiously in his notebook, jotting down every detail she mentioned. The defense attorney could sense the tide shifting against him. He tried to press further. "Emily, isn't it possible that in all the confusion, you misunderstood what was happening?" Emily looked straight at him, her young voice steady. "I didn't misunderstand. I was there. I saw everything." Her unwavering confidence cracked the defense's strategy wide open. What was meant to discredit her had only made her more credible. Rex's silent testimony, and then as if on cue, Rex himself shifted from his calm position. The big German shepherd, who had been lying patiently beside his handler, sat up straighter. His ears perked forward, and his dark eyes locked on the defendant across the room. It was a silent, powerful moment. The jurors noticed. The audience noticed. Even the judge's gaze flicked briefly toward the dog. No one spoke, but the atmosphere tightened like a drawn bowstring. Emily smiled faintly at Rex, as if reassured by his presence. "See?" she whispered into the microphone. "He knows, too." It wasn't official evidence, but it was humanly impossible to ignore. The turning point. By now, the weight of Emily's words had settled heavily over the courtroom. Her testimony wasn't just a child's recollection. It was a vivid narrative, supported by the unmistakable instincts of a trained police dog and the nervous body language of the defendant himself. The prosecutor took a step forward, his tone soft but firm. "Emily, thank you for your bravery. You've told us exactly what you saw. Can you tell us why you remember it so clearly?" Emily's answer was simple, yet it carried more force than anyone expected. Because Rex wasn't scared. He knew what that man did. And I'll never forget the way he stood there, protecting everyone. The room was utterly silent again. Not even the defense attorney dared interrupt. The ripple effect, what Emily had just said, wasn't just testimony. It was a narrative that resonated deeply with the jury. The image of a loyal police dog standing firm against a guilty man, and a child bearing witness with unshakable honesty, created a story that was difficult to unsee or unhear. Even the judge leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. He understood what had happened. A child's testimony, usually fragile and uncertain, had become the linchpin of the entire case. The defense could argue against police reports, against forensic evidence, even against eyewitnesses, but arguing against the pure conviction of a child and the silent presence of a trusted K-9 was nearly impossible. The trial in that moment had shifted. The defendant's cracked armor, for the first time since the trial began, the defendant no longer looked untouchable. His hands twitched, his face flushed, and his eyes darted nervously around the room. The jury saw it. The prosecution saw it. And worst of all for him, Emily saw it. She leaned slightly closer to the microphone, her small voice carrying once again across the tense room. "That's him. I'll never forget. Rex won't either." The words echoed like a final nail hammered into the coffin of his defense. And in that moment, everyone knew this trial would never be the same again. The tension in the courtroom was like a heavy fog that no one could escape. The defense attorney, Michael Ross, adjusted his tie with a jerky motion, beads of sweat forming at his temple. His usual confidence seemed shaken by the child's testimony, and for good reason. Emily had not wavered, not once. She had pointed at his client with the certainty of someone who had seen the truth and refused to be silenced. Still, Michael wasn't ready to surrender. His job was to dismantle the case, piece by piece, and he wasn't about to let a 10-year-old's memory topple everything he built. He stood slowly, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the witness stand with a deliberate calm. The jury watched closely. Every step he took felt like a gamble. The defense's opening strike. "Emily," Michael began, his voice gentler than before, adopting a paternal tone, "you've done very well today. You're very brave, and I respect that." Emily looked at him, blinking but not responding. She didn't smile at the praise. But Michael continued, leaning slightly against the wooden rail of the witness stand. "Sometimes when we're scared, or when something exciting happens, our minds play tricks on us. Have you ever had a dream that felt so real you thought it had actually happened?" Emily tilted her head, thinking. "Yes," she admitted quietly. The defense attorney smiled slightly, turning to the jury. "See, ladies and gentlemen, even Emily knows that sometimes our minds can create things that aren't real." He turned back to her, his eyes narrowing subtly. "Now, is it possible, just possible, that what you saw that night, with all the flashing lights and shouting, wasn't exactly what you think it was?" The question hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Emily holds her ground for a long moment. Emily didn't answer. The defense attorney waited, confident that the child would falter, stumble over her words, maybe even retract part of her story. That would be enough to plant doubt in the jury's minds. But when Emily finally spoke, her answer was not what he expected. "No," she said simply. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. Michael blinked, caught off guard. "No?" Emily shook her head. "It wasn't a dream. I remember because Rex was there. He was loud and scary that night, but not to me, to him." She pointed again at the defendant. Rex wasn't barking at the lights. He was barking at him. The courtroom murmured again, soft gasps and whispers sweeping through the audience. The judge tapped his gavel lightly to restore order, but the effect had already landed. Emily had not crumbled under pressure. She had reinforced her testimony. The defendant's cracks show. In the corner of the defense table, the defendant shifted uneasily, his face tightening. He whispered harshly to his lawyer, clearly displeased with how things were going. His jaw clenched so hard, the muscles pulsed visibly. The prosecutor, sitting quietly at his table, allowed himself the faintest smile. He knew exactly what was happening. The more Michael pressed Emily, the stronger she seemed to become. Escalating the attack, Michael Ross wasn't ready to give up. He moved closer, changing tactics. "Emily, you said you saw Rex barking at my client. But can you really be sure? There were many people there that night. Officers, bystanders. Perhaps Rex was barking at someone else. Perhaps he was barking because of the noise. Dogs are animals, Emily. They don't think like people. They don't judge guilt or innocence." He gave the jury a meaningful look, as though reminding them of logic. Emily leaned forward toward the microphone. "Rex wasn't barking at the noise," she said. "He barked every time the man moved. When the man tried to run left, Rex went left. When he tried to run right, Rex went right. He wasn't barking at anyone else, just him." The clarity of her description hit like a hammer. Several jurors nodded, almost unconsciously. The defense attorney clenched his jaw, realizing the trap he'd stepped into. Every question he asked only gave Emily another chance to strengthen her story. The jury's growing belief, juror number 6, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, tapped his pen nervously against his notepad. He had come into the trial skeptical, wary of placing too much weight on a child's testimony. But now, he found himself believing her. Juror number 3, a young woman in her 20s, scribbled furiously, underlining phrases like, "barked every time he moved," and "not at the lights." At him. Even juror number 9, who had been stoic and unreadable throughout the trial, leaned forward with his hands folded, his eyes never leaving the small girl on the stand. The defense attorney could feel the jury slipping away, one by one, and panic began to creep into his usually disciplined demeanor. Rex's presence, as if to underscore Emily's words, Rex, who had been lying patiently beside his handler, shifted slightly. The dog's sharp eyes tracked the defendant as he shifted in his chair, his ears twitching, his body subtly tense. It was uncanny, almost theatrical. Emily noticed it too. She smiled faintly, her voice calm but resolute. "See? He remembers." The jury's heads turned toward the dog, then back to the defendant. The silence in the room was deafening. It didn't matter that a dog couldn't testify in court. What mattered was the impression it left. The weight of instinct, loyalty, and truth was heavy in the air. The defense falter's Michael Ross cleared his throat, his voice faltering slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, stepping away from Emily and addressing them directly, "this testimony, while heartfelt, is the recollection of a child. Children see things differently. They imagine, they exaggerate, they fill in the gaps." He gestured toward Emily. "We cannot let emotions guide us here. Justice is about facts, evidence, and logic, not feelings." It was a decent argument. Logical, even. But as he spoke, his words felt hollow. The jury's eyes weren't on him. They were on Emily, who sat straight-backed in her chair, her hands folded neatly, her gaze honest and unwavering. Michael knew he was losing. The prosecutor's subtle victory. When it was finally the prosecutor's turn to redirect, he didn't ask many questions. He didn't need to. "Emily," he said softly, "thank you. Just one last question. Why did you come here today? Why did you decide to tell us what you saw?" Emily's eyes filled with emotion, but her voice didn't waver. "Because it's the truth. And because Rex can't talk, so I have to." The jury's reaction was immediate and powerful. Some leaned back with visible sighs, others nodded, and one woman dabbed her eyes with a tissue. The prosecutor nodded, satisfied. "No further questions, Your Honor." The courtroom atmosphere, as Emily stepped down from the stand, guided gently by a bailiff, the courtroom erupted in hushed murmurs. People whispered to one another, shaking their heads, exchanging looks of astonishment. Michael Ross sat heavily at his table, massaging his temples. His client glared at him, but for once, the confident attorney had no quick words, no clever spin. He had underestimated the child, underestimated the dog, and underestimated the power of truth told simply. The prosecutor straightened his notes, his eyes briefly meeting those of the jury. He knew the tide had turned. Emily's testimony had been more than just evidence. It had been a story, a vivid account that no one would forget. The defendant's frustration. The defendant leaned forward, whispering angrily into his lawyer's ear. Though no one could hear the words, his tone was clear. Frustration, fear, desperation. He had come into this trial confident, certain that loopholes and legal maneuvers would save him. But the sight of a child's unwavering finger pointed his way had shaken him in a way no prosecutor ever could. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, exposed, and the jury saw it. The struggle concludes. By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere was different. The defense, once bold and mocking, now looked battered. The prosecutor carried a quiet confidence. The jury carried images in their minds of flashing lights, a brave dog, and a girl who refused to be silenced. Emily had left the stand, but her words lingered like an echo, impossible to dismiss. Rex, lying calmly beside his handler, remained a silent symbol of loyalty and truth. And though the trial was far from over, everyone in that room knew the defense had lost something crucial: the jury's trust. The courthouse had a stillness that evening, the kind that felt like the air was thicker, harder to breathe. Everyone carried Emily's testimony in their minds as they shuffled back into their seats the following morning. The little girl's voice still echoed, and her finger pointing at the defendant had burned an image into every juror's thoughts. Even those who had walked in skeptical of child witnesses found themselves replaying her words, testing them against the facts they'd heard so far. The dog's quiet stare only deepened the impression. It was rare for testimony to linger with such force overnight, but this time it had. The bailiff's call brought everyone back into order. The judge entered, calm and stern, but his eyes carried the weight of the previous day. He had presided over countless trials, listened to endless witnesses, but few moments had ever left a courtroom this changed. On the prosecution side, confidence radiated quietly. They no longer had to force their case into the jurors' minds. Emily had done what no amount of cross-examination or exhibits could do. She had given them a story to hold on to, one that made sense and refused to be forgotten. The defense attorney looked tired. Michael Ross was usually sharp, with a smile that could cut through a witness's defenses, but his shoulders sagged slightly as he shuffled his notes. His client sat beside him in restless agitation, fingers tapping against the table, his eyes darting toward the jury with nervous suspicion. The arrogance that had once wrapped around him like armor had thinned, replaced with something raw fear that the walls were closing in. The prosecutor rose slowly and addressed the jury. His words weren't fiery. They weren't rehearsed for effect. They were calm, measured, designed to remind the jurors that what they had seen was not some child's imagination but a piece of truth that aligned with everything else. He spoke of the police reports, the timing of the arrest, the dog's instincts, and the scene Emily described. Piece by piece, he stitched her testimony into the larger fabric of the case, showing how it was not a stray thread, but the very thread that tied the pattern together. Jurors nodded subtly, some scribbling notes, some just listening. Their eyes occasionally flicked to Rex, who lay calmly by his handler's side, ears twitching at every noise. The dog didn't need to bark, didn't need to move. His very presence was enough, a reminder of that night and the role he had played. Emily had spoken for him, and now the jurors saw both girl and dog as one unshakable voice. The defense tried to recover, but the more Michael spoke, the thinner his arguments seemed. He asked the jury to be cautious, to remember that emotions could cloud judgment. He reminded them that children could misremember, that police dogs could misinterpret. Yet even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. His words sounded more like desperate cautions than confident reasoning. A juror leaned back, arms crossed, unimpressed. Another tapped a pen slowly against the desk, not hostile, but unconvinced. When witnesses after Emily were called, their words filled in details but lacked the impact. An officer described the chase. Another spoke about Rex's training. A neighbor recounted hearing shouting that night. All of it mattered, all of it added weight, but none of it landed like Emily's calm certainty. She had changed the tone of the entire trial, and the jurors measured every new testimony against hers. If she had said Rex barked at the man, then any supporting story was simply confirmation. The defendant grew restless, muttering angrily at his lawyer, his leg bouncing uncontrollably under the table. At one point, when the officer recounted how Rex refused to back away from him on the night of the arrest, the defendant slammed his palm on the table in frustration. The sound echoed through the courtroom, drawing startled looks. A judge immediately scolded him, reminding him to maintain composure, but the damage was done. The jury had seen his mask slip. His outburst had drawn a line between Emily's calm description of a panicked man and the defendant's own uncontrolled display. The connection was too easy to make. The whispers in the gallery spread quickly. Families leaned toward one another, murmuring, as if sharing the thought that was impossible to ignore. Maybe the child was right all along. Reporters scribbled notes faster than ever, their pens chasing the energy of the room. Even the bailiff, usually stoic, stole glances toward the jury, sensing the gravity of what had unfolded. By midday, the atmosphere was no longer uncertain. It had tilted. Where there had once been balance, where the defense still held ground, now the weight pressed heavily on one side. Emily's testimony wasn't just remembered. It was becoming the lens through which everything else was judged. The prosecution had gained more than evidence. They had gained momentum, the invisible tide that carried trials toward inevitable conclusions. The defense attorney tried again in cross-examinations, pushing witnesses harder, raising his voice with more force. But the harder he pressed, the more desperate he appeared. At one point, he snapped at an officer about the dog's reliability, his tone sharp and impatient. The jury frowned, not at the witness, but at him. His frustration was too visible. He was not dismantling the case. He was unraveling himself. Rex shifted again, sitting tall, his dark eyes scanning the room. One juror caught his gaze, then quickly looked away, unnerved but strangely convinced. People often said dogs could sense truth, and though the law didn't recognize it, the human heart often did. That silent presence did more than any word Michael Ross spoke. When court recessed, the gallery buzzed with conversation. Everyone seemed to talk at once, piecing together what they had heard, repeating Emily's words, replaying the defendant's outburst. The jurors didn't speak, of course, but the way they moved said enough. They walked slower, thoughtful, their eyes distant, as though replaying scenes in their minds. The defendant left the courtroom under heavy escort, his face dark with anger, while his lawyer whispered sharply in his ear, likely urging him to control himself. On the other side, the prosecutor closed his files neatly, his expression unreadable, but his posture tall with quiet confidence. And somewhere outside, Emily walked with her parents, away from the courthouse, unaware of how deeply her testimony still lived inside those walls. The trial wasn't over. More witnesses would come, more arguments would clash, more evidence would be laid out. But the current had shifted. No matter how hard the defense tried to steer it back, the river of this trial was now flowing in one direction. The jurors carried the memory of a little girl who had not broken under questioning, who had looked at a man accused of terrible things and said with absolute certainty, "He barked at that man." That certainty was alive in the room, alive in the jurors' minds, alive even in the silent watch of a German shepherd who never needed to say a word. The defense still had time to argue, but what they could not undo was the feeling that the truth had already been spoken, and that everything else was only noise. The courtroom felt heavier than ever as the proceedings resumed the next morning. Emily's testimony from previous days had settled over the room like a persistent shadow. Everyone who entered seemed to feel it, the jurors, the press, even the courtroom staff. The defendant, once confident, now sat stiffly, jaw clenched, eyes darting toward every movement in the room. His earlier arrogance had dissipated, replaced by a tight, unnatural tension. Michael Ross, his defense attorney, ran a hand through his hair and muttered under his breath, trying to maintain composure, but even he knew the tide had turned. The prosecutor stood first, reviewing notes with calm precision. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need flashy arguments. The weight of Emily's words had already set the tone. What remained was to weave the final threads, to present the narrative in a way that connected every fact, every witness, to the certainty the little girl had delivered. Rex, the police dog, remained at his handler's side, alert but quiet. His posture was perfect, ears perked, eyes sharp, radiating a silent authority that hung over the courtroom like an invisible reminder. Every so often, his gaze would flick toward the defendant, who squirmed uncomfortably under its intensity. Each glance seemed to pierce through the man's facade, revealing the unease he could no longer conceal. Emily was called back to the stand, her parents watching quietly from the gallery. The judge allowed her to be sworn in again, and the bailiff guided her with gentle hands to her seat. Despite the weight of attention, she walked confidently, shoulders squared, her braids swinging slightly as if nothing could sway her. Michael Ross approached first, determination etched on his face. He needed one last push to create doubt, to undermine her clarity. "Emily," he began, voice low but deliberate, "you've done very well. Very brave. But I need you to remember sometimes we make mistakes when we're nervous. The lights, the sirens, all the shouting, maybe your memory is confused?" Emily shook her head slowly, unwavering. "No," she said softly but firmly. "I remember everything." Rex knew. I knew. He barked at that man. The courtroom felt a shift. The jurors leaned forward, eyes focused, absorbing every word. Michael's argument, once a weapon, now felt flimsy against the immovable certainty of a child's memory. He pressed further. "Are you sure Rex didn't just bark at the noise? Or at the flashing lights? Or at something else? Maybe the man just happened to be there?" Emily's hazel eyes sharpened. "No, he barked at him. Every time he moved, Rex moved too. I saw it. I know what I saw." The defense attorney's jaw tightened. He had hoped for hesitation, a crack in her story, but she remained solid. He could feel the courtroom turning against him. He glanced at his client, whose pale face and clenched hands betrayed panic, but Emily's steady gaze never left him. The prosecutor didn't need to intervene immediately. The moment had power on its own. He finally rose, approaching with measured steps. "Emily," he said softly, "you've seen Rex do this before, haven't you? You understand him?" Emily nodded. "Yes, he's brave. He knows when someone is dangerous. He barked because he knew. I'll never forget it." The jurors exchanged subtle glances. Some scribbled notes quickly, others simply watched, rapt. Every word seemed to cement the scene in their minds. The man, the dog, the little girl who refused to waver. The defendant shifted again in his seat, whispering harshly to his attorney. He looked cornered, his composure unraveling, but Michael Ross tried to steady him with a calm hand on the shoulder. It did little. Every juror had already noticed the tension, the fear that the child's testimony had invoked. The prosecution called a police officer next to provide a brief recap of the events that night. He spoke clearly and concisely, confirming that the man had been intercepted and detained after Rex's persistent barking. Every detail aligned with Emily's account, further confirming her accuracy. The officer paused briefly when asked if the dog's behavior had seemed unusual. He was extremely focused, the officer said. He didn't bark at anything else. Only the suspect. The jury scribbled notes, and one man even leaned back absorbing the weight of the testimony. Michael Ross tried to interject, but the prosecutor remained poised, cutting him off gently, but firmly whenever he attempted to argue or misdirect. The tension escalated further when Rex moved slightly, lifting his head to focus on the defendant. The man's face flushed, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the table. Even without sound, Rex's posture communicated alertness and authority. The jury couldn't ignore it. The dog's instincts validated the story Emily had delivered with such clarity. Michael Ross made a final attempt, raising his voice slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen, consider the possibility of imagination, confusion, misinterpretation. A child might see things in a way adults cannot. How do you know she isn't mistaken?" Emily leaned forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm not mistaken. I saw him. Rex saw him. You can see him too. That man did wrong. And I remember." The courtroom was silent. The force of her conviction hung like a palpable presence, filling every corner. The jurors were captivated. Even the press, trained to stay neutral, scribbled frantically, recording every detail. The defendant's facade began to crumble entirely. His fingers tapped nervously against the table. His foot bounced uncontrollably. His whispered words to Michael were desperate, pleading, but the effect was clear. The public display of anxiety only reinforced the truth in Emily's testimony. He was cornered, unable to regain control. The judge allowed the prosecutor a final redirection to consolidate Emily's impact. "Ladies and gentlemen," the prosecutor said, soft but firm, "what you have seen is not just memory. It is clarity, supported by a trained officer and a canine whose instincts are honed for truth. A little girl's honesty, paired with a professional dog's discernment, has given you insight that cannot be fabricated." The jurors listened intently. They had been trained to weigh evidence carefully, to dissect facts. But this was more than evidence. It was human intuition, animal instinct, and a story that resonated with undeniable clarity. Emily returned to her seat beside her parents, her small hands folded neatly. Her job was done, yet the impression she left was immeasurable. The defendant slumped slightly, defeated, eyes darting nervously. Michael Ross straightened papers, trying to mask the tension in his shoulders, but everyone knew the outcome was tilting irreversibly. Even the judge allowed a subtle pause, letting the weight of the testimony settle. The case had reached a critical point. The story of Emily and Rex had done more than survive cross-examination. It had conquered doubt, unraveled composure, and redefined the courtroom's energy. When court recessed for the day, whispers followed everyone out. The jury lingered a moment longer, pens poised, hearts unsettled by the clear picture painted in front of them. Emily walked quietly with her parents, unaware of the magnitude of her courage and honesty. Rex trotted beside his handler, calm and alert, the silent partner in a narrative that would be remembered long after the trial ended. And in that room, the defendant knew something he could no longer deny. The walls of his defense were crumbling, and nothing could stop the truth from moving forward. The final day of the trial arrived with an atmosphere that seemed almost electric. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, the gallery buzzing with anticipation. Reporters clicked cameras and scribbled notes, their excitement barely contained. The jurors entered first, silent and composed, though the weight of the past days hung heavily on their shoulders. Each carried the memory of a small girl's unwavering testimony and the silent authority of a police dog that had spoken without words. Every witness, every piece of evidence had been filtered through that lens, shaping the jurors' perception of truth. The judge called the court to order, his gavel echoing through the chamber. "We will proceed with closing statements," he said, his voice steady but carrying a hint of gravity. The prosecutor stood first. He didn't need theatrics. He merely began to speak, his tone calm, measured, but compelling. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, looking around the room, making eye contact with each juror in turn. "Over the course of this trial, you've seen evidence, heard testimony, and witnessed events that paint a clear picture. But sometimes the clearest evidence comes in ways we least expect. It comes in the voice of a child who saw what many adults did not. It comes in the presence of a dog, trained to sense danger and deception. And it comes in the courage of one little girl who refused to remain silent." The jurors listened intently. The words were straightforward, but the weight behind them carried force. He recounted Emily's testimony, emphasizing the clarity of her memory, the instinctual behavior of Rex, and the nervous demeanor of the defendant during her description. He spoke not only to the facts, but to the emotional truth, the moments that could not be faked or fabricated. He paused, letting the silence hang in the room, before continuing. "This case isn't just about what happened. It's about recognizing truth, about listening carefully, and about understanding that some truths are undeniable. Emily has told you what she saw. Rex has shown you, without words, what he sensed. And the defendant's reactions, witnessed by all of us, confirmed the accuracy of her account." When he finished, the murmurs of acknowledgement were subtle but widespread. He returned to his seat, composed and confident, leaving the courtroom in a quiet hum of anticipation. Michael Ross rose next, his expression a mixture of determination and restraint. He knew the challenge before him was almost insurmountable. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm, "you have been presented with many elements over the past days. You have heard testimony, seen evidence, and witnessed events that may sway your perception. But remember, a trial is not won by emotion. It is won by facts, by certainty, and by the law. Consider carefully whether what you have heard is factual or influenced by perception." He spoke of the complexities of memory, the nature of animals, and the unpredictability of human witnesses. Even a child's testimony, while sincere, can be influenced by fear, by suggestion, or by imagination. And dogs, no matter how well trained, react to stimuli in ways humans interpret. It is your duty to weigh all evidence with care and caution. The jurors nodded, taking in the final appeal, though the calm confidence of the defense felt less impactful than he intended. Emily's story had settled in their minds, paired with the visual of Rex's unwavering presence, and no amount of reasoning could completely erase the impression it had left. The judge then gave the standard instructions, reminding jurors of their responsibility to deliberate solely on the evidence presented and to maintain impartiality. He emphasized the weight of the law, the duty to seek justice, and the necessity of honest, thoughtful discussion. The words hung in the air as the jurors filed out to begin deliberations. The gallery remained tense and hushed. Everyone understood that the next hours would be decisive, that the whispers of speculation would soon give way to a definitive outcome. Emily clutched her mother's hand, unaware of the magnitude of her impact, while Rex rested quietly, alert and patient beside his handler. Inside the deliberation room, the jurors began their discussion methodically. They recounted each testimony, each piece of evidence, and Emily's clear description of Rex's behavior and the defendant's reactions. They debated quietly, weighing the credibility of the witnesses, the chain of events, and the visual impression of the dog's instincts. Slowly, the narrative that had been constructed throughout the trial began to crystallize in their minds. The little girl's confidence became the anchor for their deliberation. Every time a juror considered doubt, they returned to her words. "He barked at that man. I saw it. I know what I saw." The image of Rex, alert and unwavering, reinforced the memory. Even those who had initially been skeptical found themselves persuaded not by force of argument alone, but by the undeniable conviction of Emily's testimony, combined with the dog's instinctual response. Hours passed as they discussed every detail, reviewed each fact, and tested their reasoning against one another. The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of papers and occasional muttered agreement. Finally, a consensus emerged. The weight of truth, the clarity of observation, and the instinctual corroboration of the K-9 officer were too compelling to ignore. The verdict became apparent, the result of careful deliberation that aligned with the evidence and testimony. When the jurors returned to the courtroom, their faces were solemn but resolute. The defendant's posture stiffened, a flicker of fear passing across his face as he sensed the outcome. The gallery fell silent, all eyes on the jury box as the foreperson stood to announce the decision. On the charge of assault and attempted escape, the foreperson began, voice steady. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom reacted instantly. A mixture of murmurs, gasps, and subdued exclamations spread through the room. The defendant slumped slightly, the tension leaving him in a rush of despair. Michael Ross placed a hand on his shoulder, offering comfort that felt hollow in the face of a conclusive verdict. Emily's parents held her tightly, pride and relief washing over their faces. Emily herself stood quietly, absorbing the moment, perhaps too young to fully understand its depth, yet aware that her words had mattered more than she could have imagined. Rex shifted slightly, as if sensing the release of tension, and wagged his tail once, a small acknowledgement of the role he had played. He had been more than a witness. He had been a silent partner in revealing the truth. The judge addressed the courtroom, emphasizing the importance of justice, the weight of the law, and the solemnity of the proceedings. He reminded everyone that verdicts were reached through careful consideration, guided by evidence and the principles of fairness. His words reinforced the gravity of what had just occurred. Outside the courtroom, the press swarmed, eager to capture the story of the little girl who had helped bring a criminal to justice, and the K-9 officer whose instincts had quietly corroborated her account. Reporters and photographers crowded the hallways, recording statements and capturing images of Emily and her family. Yet, amidst the chaos, Emily remained calm, holding her mother's hand, her attention occasionally flicking toward Rex, who remained stoic and dignified. The defendant was escorted from the courtroom, his expression a mix of disbelief and frustration. The weight of consequence settled upon him, the realization that his actions had been observed, remembered, and confirmed by the smallest witness in the room. As the courthouse emptied and the day wound down, the story of courage, instinct, and unwavering truth spread quietly among those who had been present. Emily had proven that even the youngest voices could hold immense power. Rex had demonstrated that instinct, loyalty, and training could communicate truths that words alone could not convey. Together, they had changed the course of a trial, leaving an impression that would linger long after the final gavel fell. The city outside bustled on, oblivious to the quiet triumphs within the courtroom. But for those who had witnessed it, the lesson was clear. Truth could come from the most unexpected sources, and courage, whether human or animal, could stand against fear, deceit, and wrongdoing. Emily's words, paired with Rex's silent authority, had not only revealed the facts, but reminded everyone present of the extraordinary power of honesty, observation, and steadfastness in the face of uncertainty. And as the doors of the courthouse closed behind the last departing visitor, one thing was certain. This was a story that would be remembered, not for the fear it had exposed, but for the bravery, loyalty, and truth that had triumphed in the end.